April 19th, 1945. Camp Clinton, Mississippi. Hauptmann Klaus Becker sat across a wooden table from a young American officer who had just introduced himself as Second Lieutenant Michael Patterson, fighter pilot with the 352nd Fighter Group. Patterson wore the silver wings of a qualified pilot and the ribbon of the Distinguished Flying Cross. His uniform was crisp, his bearing confident. He looked, to Becker's experienced eye, approximately 21 years old. Becker, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot with over 400 combat hours and 12 confirmed victories, had been shot down over Belgium 3 weeks earlier while flying his Messerschmitt Bf-109 against American bomber formations. He had expected many things about captivity in America, but not this. Not sitting across from a child wearing pilot's wings who spoke casually about flying the P-51 Mustang on long-range escort missions deep into Germany. "How many hours do you have?" Becker asked in careful English, the question emerging more sharply than he intended. Patterson glanced at his logbook, which lay open on the table. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. About 380 total flight time. Maybe 140, 150 combat. Becker stared. This boy, this American who looked barely old enough to shave regularly, had logged nearly 200 hours of advanced training before ever seeing combat. In the Luftwaffe, by 1944, replacement pilots arrived at operational squadrons with sometimes as few as 100 total hours, minimal instrument training, and often no gunnery training whatsoever. They were sent into combat against veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft, and they died within days. The conversation that followed would shatter Becker's understanding of why Germany had lost the air war. It was not merely about the P-51 Mustang's superior range and performance, facts he had grudgingly accepted during his final months of combat. It was about the systematic, almost casual manner in which America produced these young pilots by the thousands. 21-year-old fighter pilots, with 300 hours of training, 18-year-old bomber commanders who navigated across oceans using instruments Becker had never seen, 19-year-old mechanics who maintained complex aircraft engines with textbooks and standardized procedures rather than improvisation and desperation. The industrial might that had crushed Germany was not just in factories producing aircraft and tanks. It was in the vast, invisible infrastructure that transformed farm boys and college students into highly trained combat aviators in less time than it took to build a battleship. And Klaus Becker, sitting in that Mississippi prison camp, was about to witness exactly how that system worked. The United States Army Air Force's pilot training program represented one of the most ambitious and successful mass education efforts in human history. Between 1939 and 1945, American training facilities transformed approximately 200,000 young men into qualified pilots. This figure did not include navigators, bombardiers, gunners, or the vast number of support personnel required to sustain air operations. 200,000 pilots, Germany's entire Luftwaffe, from its founding in 1933 through the end of the war, trained approximately 130,000 total pilots over 12 years. The scale alone defied German comprehension. But more remarkable than the numbers was the systematic approach, the standardized curriculum, and the sheer abundance of resources devoted to ensuring American pilots arrived at operational squadrons thoroughly prepared for combat operations. The training pipeline began with recruitment and selection. Unlike Germany, where military aviation attracted primarily young men from families with existing military traditions or the resources to pursue flight training. Privately, American aviation training drew from the entire society: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, all became candidates for pilot training if they could pass the qualifying examinations. The Aviation Cadet Program, established well before Pearl Harbor and dramatically expanded after December 1941, processed tens of thousands of applicants monthly through selection centers across the nation. Physical examinations checked vision, hearing, reflexes, and general health. Written examinations tested mathematical aptitude, mechanical reasoning, and general intelligence. Psychological evaluations attempted to identify candidates with appropriate temperament for the stress of combat flying. The selection process itself demonstrated American organizational efficiency and systematic thinking. Standardized testing procedures ensured consistent evaluation regardless of location. Documented protocols governed every aspect of examination. Statistical analysis tracked pass rates and correlated selection criteria with subsequent training success, allowing continuous refinement of the selection process based on empirical evidence rather than tradition or assumption. Those who passed selection entered a training pipeline that lasted approximately 1 year from initial classification through assignment to operational squadrons. This timeline shocked German prisoners like Becker who learned about it. 1 year to produce a combat-ready fighter pilot. The Luftwaffe had reduced its training program from 18 months in 1939 to as little as 4 months by 1944, sacrificing thorough preparation for desperate need for replacement pilots. The American training program divided into distinct phases, each designed to build specific skills progressively before advancing to more complex operations. Primary flight training lasted approximately 9 weeks at civilian-operated contract schools, scattered across the southern United States, where favorable weather permitted year-round flying operations. Cadets learned basic aircraft control, takeoffs and landings, and fundamental navigation using simple, forgiving aircraft like the Stearman PT-13 or PT-17 biplane trainers. These primary trainers were purpose-built for instruction, stable, and forgiving of student errors, with excellent visibility and gentle handling characteristics that built confidence while teaching essential skills. Each cadet received approximately 65 flight hours during primary training, with instruction following standardized curricula that ensured consistent training regardless of which contract school they attended. Ground school classes covered theory of flight, aircraft systems, navigation principles, meteorology, and military regulations. Physical training maintained fitness levels. The program emphasized not just teaching students to fly, but teaching them to think systematically about flying, to understand principles rather than merely memorize procedures. Following successful completion of primary training, cadets advanced to basic flight training, another 9-week program conducted at Army Air Forces bases, using more powerful and complex aircraft like the Vultee BT-13, known universally as the vibrator for its tendency to shake at certain power settings. Basic training introduced 70 additional flight hours focusing on more advanced maneuvers, precision flying, instrument flying under hood, formation flying, and night operations. Instrument training received particular emphasis during this phase. American training doctrine recognized that combat operations occurred regardless of weather, requiring pilots capable of flying and navigating in clouds, at night, and in other conditions where visual references were limited or non-existent. German training programs, increasingly constrained by fuel shortages and compressed timelines, often provided minimal or no instrument training. The result was predictable. German pilots who inadvertently entered clouds or encountered bad weather frequently became disoriented and crashed, while American pilots routinely flew and fought in weather conditions that grounded the Luftwaffe. The third phase, advanced training, lasted approximately 10 weeks and represented the final preparation before assignment to operational units. Fighter pilots trained on aircraft like the North American AT-6 Texan, a sophisticated advanced trainer with retractable landing gear, variable pitch propeller, and handling characteristics similar to frontline fighters. This phase emphasized tactics, gunnery, and the specialized skills required for specific combat roles. Fighter pilots practiced air-to-air gunnery against towed targets and conducted mock combat with other student pilots, learning energy management, deflection shooting, and tactical maneuvering. They studied enemy aircraft capabilities, recognition features, and known tactics. They practiced dive bombing and strafing ground targets. They learned formation flying, communications procedures, and mission planning. Bomber pilots transitioned to multi-engine aircraft, learning to manage complex systems, coordinate crew actions, and navigate long-distance missions. They practiced instrument approaches to minimum altitudes, emergency procedures for engine failures, and precision bombing techniques. The total flight hours accumulated during these training phases typically exceeded 200 hours before a pilot ever reached an operational unit. This figure represented more training than many German pilots received in their entire careers, including combat time. But the hours themselves told only part of the story. The quality of training, the systematic curriculum, the standardized procedures, and the abundance of resources dedicated to thorough preparation separated American training from German approaches even more than the raw numbers. Training aircraft were purpose-built for instruction, not obsolete combat types unsuitable for frontline service. Fuel was abundant, allowing students to practice maneuvers repeatedly until achieving consistent proficiency rather than limiting training flights to conserve scarce resources. Instructors were experienced pilots, specially trained in teaching techniques, following documented curricula rather than improvising based on personal preference. Most remarkably, from the German perspective, training continued even after pilots reached operational squadrons. Replacement pilots arriving at fighter groups in England or bomber squadrons in Italy did not immediately fly combat missions. Instead, they underwent additional theatre indoctrination training lasting several weeks, familiarizing them with local conditions, specific threats, current tactics, and the particular aircraft variants they would fly in combat. Fighter groups typically assigned new pilots to experienced flight leaders for their first several missions, allowing them to gain combat experience gradually, while under the protection and guidance of veterans who could intervene if inexperienced pilots made dangerous mistakes. Bomber crews flew multiple training missions together before being assigned to combat operations, ensuring crew coordination and familiarity with procedures. This systematic approach to training reflected broader American military philosophy, emphasizing thorough preparation over rapid mobilization. German military culture valued aggressive spirit, individual initiative, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. American culture valued systematic preparation, standardized procedures, and reducing combat to a series of practiced techniques that could be executed reliably under stress. Neither approach was inherently superior in all circumstances. German methods produced exceptionally capable pilots when resources permitted thorough training and when operational conditions allowed experienced pilots to develop and refine their skills through sustained combat. But German methods collapsed catastrophically when resource constraints forced compressed training and when attrition destroyed experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced with adequately trained personnel. American methods proved remarkably scalable, capable of absorbing vast numbers of trainees and producing consistently competent pilots even during periods of massive expansion. The systematic approach, documented procedures, and standardized curricula meant that training quality remained relatively consistent regardless of which specific base conducted the training or which particular instructors provided the teaching. Klaus Becker learned about this training system gradually during his months in American captivity, through conversations with guards, observations of American military operations, and deliberate questioning of anyone willing to discuss such matters. Other Luftwaffe prisoners across camps throughout the United States underwent similar education, sometimes through formal orientation programs, but more often through informal interactions with American personnel, who saw no reason to conceal information about training programs. The psychological impact of these revelations proved profound and lasting. German pilots had understood intellectually that American industrial capacity exceeded German capabilities in aircraft production, but they had assumed, hoped, and been told repeatedly by propaganda that German pilots remained individually superior through better training, greater combat experience, and superior fighting spirit. The comfortable assumption that quality compensated for quantity, that German excellence offset American abundance, dissolved when confronted with evidence that American pilots received more thorough training, flew more advanced aircraft, and fought as part of a logistical and organizational system that supported and sustained combat operations far more effectively than the increasingly chaotic German military establishment. The trainers themselves represented a revelation: purpose-built training aircraft designed specifically for teaching flying skills rather than adapted combat types or obsolete designs no longer suitable for frontline service. The Stearman PT-13 primary trainer, for instance, was a robust biplane with docile handling, excellent visibility, and forgiving characteristics that allowed student pilots to learn fundamental skills without excessive risk. Over 10,000 were manufactured specifically for training purposes during the war. The North American AT-6 Texan Advanced Trainer was even more impressive to German observers. This was a sophisticated aircraft with retractable landing gear, a powerful 600 horsepower engine, variable pitch propeller, and handling characteristics deliberately designed to simulate frontline fighters. The United States produced over 15,000 AT-6 variants during the war, using them to prepare pilots for transition to high-performance combat aircraft. Germany, by contrast, increasingly used obsolete Bf-109 variants and worn-out aircraft withdrawn from combat for training, when they could afford to conduct training flights at all given severe fuel shortages. The abundance of training aircraft, instructors, facilities, and fuel demonstrated American resource availability and organizational commitment to thorough pilot preparation. Training was not an afterthought or a necessary evil to be minimized in favor of getting pilots to operational units as quickly as possible. It was understood as essential preparation that directly influenced combat effectiveness and pilot survival rates. American training doctrine emphasized standardization and documentation in ways that struck German observers as almost obsessively systematic. Every training maneuver had documented procedures. Every emergency situation had prescribed responses. Instructors followed curriculum guides that specified precisely what students should learn at each stage of training. Students studied technical manuals that explained aircraft systems, operating procedures, and performance characteristics in comprehensive detail. This approach contrasted sharply with German aviation culture, which traditionally emphasized individual skill, experience-based knowledge, and the judgment of experienced pilots. German training, when resources and time permitted it to be conducted properly, could produce exceptional pilots with deep understanding and highly refined skills. But the German approach did not scale effectively when circumstances required rapid expansion, and it broke down catastrophically when experienced instructors were lost to combat attrition faster than they could pass their knowledge to new students. American standardization meant that any qualified instructor could teach any student using documented procedures, regardless of the instructor's personal background or previous experience. The loss of individual instructors, while certainly unfortunate, did not destroy accumulated knowledge or disrupt training programs, because that knowledge existed in written form rather than residing solely in the minds of experienced personnel. The ground school curriculum impressed Klaus Becker perhaps more than the flight training itself when he learned the details. American student pilots received extensive classroom instruction in subjects. German pilots often learned piecemeal through experience or not at all. Navigation training covered dead reckoning using time, speed, and direction calculations, pilotage using visual landmarks and maps, radio navigation using various electronic aids, and celestial navigation using sextants to measure star positions for long-range over-water flights. American pilots learned to plan missions systematically, calculating fuel requirements, plotting courses, identifying checkpoints, and preparing alternate plans for various contingencies. Meteorology instruction taught pilots to read weather maps, understand atmospheric conditions affecting flight operations, recognize dangerous weather phenomena, and make informed decisions about mission feasibility based on forecasts and observed conditions. Aircraft systems training covered engine operation in detail, hydraulic and electrical systems, fuel systems, armament systems, and emergency procedures for various failure modes. American pilots understood how their aircraft worked, what various instruments indicated, and how to respond appropriately when systems malfunctioned. Tactics instruction introduced formation flying procedures, combat maneuvering techniques, gunnery principles, and defensive tactics. Students studied enemy aircraft capabilities, learned recognition features to distinguish friendly from hostile aircraft quickly, and received intelligence briefings on current enemy tactics and techniques. This comprehensive ground school education, combined with extensive flight training, produced pilots who arrived at operational squadrons with broad theoretical knowledge and substantial practical experience. They were not yet combat veterans, but they possessed thorough foundational preparation that allowed them to learn from combat experience without requiring complete on-the-job training in basic skills that should have been mastered previously. The infrastructure supporting American pilot training was itself remarkable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Dozens of training bases scattered across the southern and western United States, each capable of processing hundreds of students simultaneously through standardized programs. Administrative systems tracked each student's progress, documented training flights, and maintained comprehensive records. Medical facilities provided immediate care for training accidents and ongoing health monitoring. Recreation facilities, libraries, and educational programs supported student morale during the demanding training period. The system operated with an efficiency and scale that seemed almost industrial in its organized mass production of trained pilots. And indeed, that comparison was apt. American military training applied the same systematic thinking, standardized procedures, and resource abundance that characterized American industrial production. The result was similar: consistent output at massive scale, produced efficiently through documented processes that could be replicated across multiple locations. German prisoners observed this training infrastructure indirectly through interactions with American personnel and directly when camps were located near training bases. They watched aircraft conducting training flights, observed the steady flow of student pilots progressing through the system, and noted the casual confidence with which young American pilots discussed their training experiences. The most psychologically devastating aspect was perhaps not the scale or systematic nature of American training, but the ages of the pilots being produced. Klaus Becker's conversation with the 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Patterson was not unusual. American combat pilots were overwhelmingly young, often very young, yet they flew complex missions with apparently casual competence that belied their limited life experience. Becker had entered the Luftwaffe in 1937 at age 19, undergoing 18 months of thorough training before assignment to his first operational unit in 1939. He had been considered young but adequately prepared. By 1944, Luftwaffe replacement pilots arrived at frontline squadrons at 18 or 19 years old, with perhaps 3 or 4 months of compressed training and minimal flight hours. These boys died quickly, usually within their first few combat missions, shot down by more experienced Allied pilots, or falling victim to their own inadequate training. American pilots were often comparably young in age, but they arrived at combat squadrons with training measured in months and hundreds of flight hours, rather than weeks and minimal experience. More critically, they continued receiving support, guidance, and additional training even after reaching operational status. They flew as part of large formations where numerical superiority and tactical coordination compensated for individual inexperience. They operated within logistical and organizational systems that sustained combat operations effectively rather than the increasingly chaotic German military establishment, struggling with fuel shortages, spare parts scarcity, and collapsing infrastructure. The training revelations forced German prisoners to confront uncomfortable questions about their own preparation and the system that had sent them into combat. Had they been adequately trained? With hindsight and the opportunity to observe American approaches, many concluded they had not been, despite having received what the Luftwaffe considered standard preparation for their era. The systematic American approach, the abundance of resources, the documented procedures, and the emphasis on thorough preparation before combat exposure represented a qualitatively different philosophy that produced measurably different results. The statistics, when prisoners learned them, told a devastating story about relative national commitment to pilot training and the resources available to support that training. The United States operated approximately 60 training airfields during the war, processing tens of thousands of students annually through standardized programs. Germany, at its peak, operated fewer than 30 primary training facilities, and by 1944 many had been damaged by Allied bombing, relocated to avoid attacks, or closed due to fuel shortages. American training consumed vast quantities of aviation fuel, perhaps 10% of total military aviation fuel usage, allocated specifically to training operations. Germany, facing severe and worsening fuel shortages from 1943 onward, increasingly restricted training flights to conserve precious fuel for combat operations. The immediate result was predictable: combat pilots with inadequate training who died quickly. The longer-term result was catastrophic: a death spiral where inadequate training produced pilot losses that required even more replacement pilots who received even less training, accelerating losses further. American training aircraft production exceeded 15,000 purpose-built trainers of various types during the war. Germany manufactured perhaps 3,000 dedicated training aircraft during the same period, increasingly relying on combat aircraft too worn or damaged for frontline service. The number of flight instructors employed by American training programs exceeded 10,000 at peak strength. Germany struggled to maintain adequate instructor cadres, frequently pulling experienced combat pilots from operational units for temporary instructor duty, reducing both training capacity and frontline strength simultaneously. These quantitative comparisons revealed resource disparities so vast that German prisoners struggled to comprehend how their nation had imagined victory was achievable, given such overwhelming material disadvantages. The training infrastructure alone, independent of aircraft production, industrial capacity, or other factors, demonstrated American advantages of such magnitude that German defeat seemed, in retrospect, mathematically inevitable. The revelation extended beyond mere flight training to encompass the entire support ecosystem that sustained American air operations. German prisoners working on labor details near American airfields observed maintenance operations that operated with systematic efficiency, documented procedures, and resource abundance that made German field maintenance seem primitive by faith comparison. American maintenance crews worked with comprehensive technical manuals that provided detailed instructions, exploded diagrams, and troubleshooting procedures for every aircraft system. These manuals were printed in thousands of copies, distributed widely, and regularly updated with technical bulletins addressing newly discovered issues or improved procedures. German maintenance personnel, by contrast, often relied on experience, improvisation, and scarce technical documentation that might exist in only a few copies per base. Spare parts availability demonstrated American logistical sophistication and industrial capacity. American maintenance units maintained extensive inventories of standardized components, ordered replacements through systematic supply chains, and rarely faced situations where aircraft sat grounded awaiting critical parts. German maintenance operations by 1944 increasingly involved cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep others flying, fabricating improvised replacement parts when genuine components were unavailable, and accepting reduced operational readiness as unavoidable given supply constraints. The tools and equipment available to American maintenance crews would have seemed luxurious to German ground personnel: specialized tools designed for specific maintenance tasks, hydraulic test equipment, electrical diagnostic instruments, engine maintenance stands, and comprehensive workshop facilities were standard provision. German field maintenance often made do with basic hand tools, improvised equipment, and minimal test instruments. Klaus Becker observed some of this maintenance infrastructure during work details at the camp, but other prisoners assigned to work near active American airfields witnessed it more directly. Oberleutnant Heinrich Müller, held at Camp Forest in Tennessee, worked briefly on a detail that brought him daily to an airfield where P-47 Thunderbolts operated. His observations, recorded in letters home after the war and later published in a German aviation journal, provided detailed accounts of American maintenance operations. Müller described watching American crew chiefs conduct routine inspections following documented checklists that ensured consistent, thorough examination of every critical system. He observed mechanics troubleshooting engine problems using systematic diagnostic procedures rather than intuition or guesswork. He noted the casual efficiency with which damaged aircraft were repaired, often returned to operational status within hours or days rather than the weeks or months. Similar repairs might require in German service given parts shortages and overcrowded maintenance facilities. The integration of young, recently trained personnel into this efficient system particularly impressed German observers. American ground crews included many 18- and 19-year-old mechanics who had received several months of technical training at specialized schools before assignment to operational units. These young technicians worked from manuals and technical orders, applying documented procedures rather than relying solely on experience accumulated over years. German maintenance training had traditionally emphasized apprenticeship models, where younger personnel learned gradually from experienced mechanics through observation and hands-on work under supervision. This approach produced highly skilled technicians when time and circumstances permitted, but it did not scale effectively during wartime expansion, and it broke down when experienced personnel were lost faster than their knowledge could be transferred to replacements. American technical training schools operated similarly to pilot training programs. Standardized curricula, documented procedures, purpose-built training facilities, and systematic instruction that produced consistently competent graduates in relatively short timeframes. The Aviation Mechanics School at Keesler Field, in Mississippi, for example, could process thousands of students annually through various specialized courses covering aircraft engines, airframes, electrical systems, and other technical specialties. This systematic approach to training extended throughout American military aviation. Navigators attended specialized navigation schools, learning dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and radio navigation techniques. Bombardiers trained at bombardier schools, practicing with specialized equipment including the Norden bomb sight, a sophisticated analog computer that calculated bomb release points accounting for aircraft speed, altitude, wind, and target motion. Aerial gunners attended gunnery schools, learning to operate various machine gun turrets, practice deflection shooting against towed targets, and study enemy fighter tactics. Radio operators trained at radio schools, learning Morse code, radio procedures, and equipment operation. Every crew position had associated specialized training that prepared personnel thoroughly before assignment to operational units. The scale of this training enterprise staggered German prisoners when they learned the numbers. The United States trained approximately 50,000 navigators during the war, 45,000 bombardiers, hundreds of thousands of gunners, radio operators, and mechanics. The infrastructure required to support this training, the bases, instructors, equipment, and training aircraft, represented an investment in human capital development on a scale Germany never attempted and probably could not have sustained given resource constraints. The bomber crew training system particularly demonstrated American systematic thinking and organizational sophistication. Heavy bomber crews consisted of 10 men in B-17 Flying Fortresses or B-24 Liberators. Each crewman trained individually in his specialty at different schools. Then crews were formed and trained together as units before assignment to operational bomb groups. This crew training phase lasted several weeks and emphasized coordination, communication, and emergency procedures. Crews practiced bombing runs, navigation exercises, gunnery drills, and formation flying. They learned to function as integrated teams, where each member understood his responsibilities and how individual actions affected overall mission success. They practiced emergency procedures repeatedly, simulating engine failures, battle damage, and various crisis situations that might occur during combat operations. Only after completing this comprehensive individual and crew training did bomber crews deploy to combat theaters. Even then, upon arrival at operational bomb groups in England or Italy, crews typically flew several non-combat missions, familiarizing themselves with local conditions, routes, and procedures before being assigned to combat operations against defended targets in Germany. This methodical, systematic approach to preparation reflected American military culture, emphasizing thorough training as essential foundation for combat effectiveness. The investment of time, resources, and effort in preparation before combat exposure contrasted sharply with German approaches that increasingly, by necessity rather than preference, pushed inadequately prepared personnel into combat situations where they faced overwhelming odds with minimal preparation. The quality of American training showed in combat results that German prisoners learned about through various sources. American bomber crews completed 25 mission tours, then rotated home. 8th Air Force bomber crews in 1944 and 1945 faced approximately 3 to 4% loss rates per mission, meaning roughly half of crews survived their 25 mission tours and rotated home with accumulated experience, specialized knowledge, and combat-earned expertise. These veterans often returned to training commands as instructors, bringing combat experience directly into training programs and ensuring that instruction remained current with tactical developments and operational realities. The systematic rotation of combat veterans through training assignments created a continuous feedback loop that improved training quality based on actual combat experience. Germany lacked resources to implement similar rotation policies. Combat pilots and crew typically remained in frontline service until they were killed, seriously wounded, or the war ended. The loss of experienced personnel through attrition was absolute and irreplaceable. Knowledge and skill accumulated through combat experience died with the individuals who possessed it, rather than being systematically transferred to training programs and new personnel. The psychological impact on German prisoners of understanding the scope, scale, and sophistication of American training programs proved profound and lasting. These revelations forced fundamental reassessment of assumptions about why Germany lost the air war and what that defeat meant about relative national capabilities. German propaganda had attributed Allied success to overwhelming material superiority, crude quantity overwhelming refined quality. This explanation allowed Germans to maintain pride in their own capabilities while acknowledging material disadvantages. The training revelations demolished this comfortable rationalization. American pilots were not merely more numerous. They were frequently better trained, more thoroughly prepared, and supported by systematic infrastructure that sustained combat effectiveness over time. The abundance of resources devoted to training, the thousands of aircraft built specifically for instruction, the tens of thousands of instructors, the dozens of training bases, the comprehensive curriculum, demonstrated American commitment to human capital development that matched the industrial capacity that produced vast quantities of combat aircraft. America did not simply outproduce Germany. It systematically outprepared German forces through superior training, better organization, and more effective use of available human resources. Klaus Becker spent considerable time during his captivity discussing these matters with other Luftwaffe prisoners. The conversations frequently turned to questions about what different decisions or approaches might have altered outcomes, though most participants recognized these discussions as essentially academic exercises. Germany's resource constraints, strategic situation, and the fundamental power imbalance with the United States made defeat inevitable, regardless of tactical decisions or operational approaches. The training disparities were symptoms of deeper problems rather than causes in themselves. Germany lacked the fuel to conduct extensive training, even if the will and organizational capacity existed. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to produce thousands of purpose-built training aircraft while simultaneously manufacturing combat types. Germany lacked the geographic security to operate numerous training bases without fear of enemy attack. Germany lacked the systematic organizational culture that characterized American military and industrial approaches. These fundamental disadvantages accumulated and compounded throughout the war. Initial German advantages in pilot experience and tactical sophistication from early war campaigns gradually eroded as veteran pilots were lost and replacement training degraded. American advantages in resources, organization, and systematic approach accumulated over time as training programs matured. Combat experience, refined tactics, and industrial production reached peak efficiency. By 1944, when Klaus Becker was shot down, German fighter pilots faced American opponents who possessed every significant advantage: more thorough training, more flight hours, superior aircraft, numerical superiority, better logistics, effective tactical coordination, and the confidence that came from belonging to a military establishment that was clearly winning rather than desperately fighting to delay inevitable defeat. The meetings between German prisoners and young American pilots became increasingly common in camps across the United States during 1944 and 1945 as Allied advances in Europe resulted in growing numbers of captured Luftwaffe personnel. These interactions, sometimes formal through organized prisoner orientation programs, but more often informal through casual conversations, provided German prisoners with direct evidence of American training approaches and pilot quality. Many German prisoners, particularly officers, spoke at least some English learned through peacetime education. American guards and camp personnel were often willing to talk with prisoners about non-sensitive subjects, including their own backgrounds and training experiences. The cumulative result was thorough German prisoner education about American military aviation training that would have been impossible to obtain through intelligence gathering during active combat operations. The American willingness to discuss training programs openly reflected confidence rather than carelessness. By 1944, American military planners understood that the air war was essentially won. German industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed, fuel production was collapsing, and pilot training had degraded to levels that could not sustain operations against American numerical and qualitative superiority. Knowledge about American training programs provided no actionable intelligence that could alter these fundamental strategic realities. Some American personnel even seemed to take a certain satisfaction in educating German prisoners about the scope and sophistication of American training. These discussions served multiple purposes. They provided concrete evidence of American capabilities that undermined any remaining German confidence in ultimate victory. They demonstrated American systematic thinking and organizational sophistication. They illustrated the vast resource gap that had made German defeat inevitable, regardless of tactical prowess or fighting spirit. The re-education programs that American authorities implemented in some prisoner camps sometimes incorporated information about military training as part of broader efforts to demonstrate American capabilities and democratic values. Prisoners attended lectures, watched films, and participated in discussions covering various aspects of American society, industry, and military organization. Training programs were included as examples of American systematic approach to complex challenges and effective use of resources. Klaus Becker participated in some of these programs during his captivity at Camp Clinton. He attended lectures about American industrial production, agricultural methods, and educational systems. The presentations emphasized systematic planning, standardized procedures, and efficient resource use as characteristic American approaches to various challenges. The parallels between industrial mass production and military training mass production were explicitly drawn, illustrating how similar organizational thinking applied across different domains. These re-education efforts achieved mixed results in their stated goal of promoting democratic values and attitudes favorable to post-war cooperation. However, they were remarkably effective at convincing German prisoners of American industrial, organizational, and technological capabilities. Prisoners who might have dismissed written intelligence reports or propaganda materials found direct observation and personal conversations with American personnel far more persuasive. The evidence was simply too consistent, too detailed, and too clearly genuine to dismiss as fabrication or exaggeration. American training programs were real, operated at the described scale, and produced the results observable in combat effectiveness. The young pilots with hundreds of training hours were real, not propaganda inventions. The systematic procedures, standardized curricula, and abundant resources were real, not claims unsupported by evidence. The post-war period saw many former Luftwaffe prisoners return to Germany, carrying detailed knowledge about American training methods, organizational approaches, and systematic thinking. Some of this knowledge influenced the development of the West German Bundeswehr Air Force established in 1955. German military planners, including former Luftwaffe officers who had experienced American captivity, incorporated lessons learned from observing American approaches. The emphasis on systematic training, documented procedures, and thorough preparation before operational assignment became standard in Bundeswehr aviation. Purpose-built training aircraft were procured rather than using obsolete combat types. Training curricula were documented and standardized. Flight hours were specified as minimum requirements before advancement to operational status. The influence of American approaches was clear to anyone familiar with both systems. Similar influences appeared in German civil aviation development during the post-war period. Lufthansa, reformed in 1955, implemented pilot training programs that reflected American systematic approaches rather than traditional German methods. Standardized procedures, documented curricula, and emphasis on consistent quality through systematic instruction became characteristic of German commercial aviation training. The technical knowledge that German prisoners gained through observation and inquiry extended beyond training programs to include aircraft design, philosophy, maintenance approaches, and logistical systems. Former Luftwaffe personnel returned to Germany with detailed knowledge about P-51 Mustang capabilities, B-17 flying, fortress construction, and American aviation industry practices. This knowledge influenced post-war German aviation development in numerous subtle ways. German aviation engineers designing post-war aircraft incorporated lessons about the importance of maintainability, the value of standardized components, and the benefits of systematic documentation. The American approach of designing aircraft with maintenance accessibility as a priority rather than an afterthought influenced German design thinking. The emphasis on standardization across different aircraft types to simplify spare parts, logistics, and maintenance training became standard German practice. The story of Luftwaffe prisoners, discovering the youth and extensive training of American P-51 pilots, represents a specific instance of a broader pattern. German military personnel across all services discovered during captivity in America that their defeat resulted not primarily from lack of courage, tactical skill, or fighting spirit, but from fundamental disadvantages in resources, organization, and systematic application of industrial capacity to military purposes. The training revelations were perhaps among the most psychologically significant because they challenged German pride in military professionalism and excellence. German military culture had traditionally emphasized superior training, tactical sophistication, and individual skill as sources of advantage over potential adversaries. The discovery that American military training often exceeded German training in thoroughness, systematization, and resource investment undermined this foundational assumption. The abundance of resources America devoted to training, the casual efficiency with which young pilots were produced by the thousands, the systematic infrastructure supporting continuous improvement through combat veteran feedback, demonstrated capabilities that Germany simply could not match given strategic circumstances and resource constraints. The revelation was sobering rather than inspiring, illustrating the magnitude of Allied advantages. Klaus Becker returned to Germany in 1946 after nearly 18 months in American captivity. He carried with him detailed knowledge about American aviation training, maintenance procedures, organizational approaches, and systematic thinking. Like many former Luftwaffe prisoners, he struggled initially to find his place in devastated post-war Germany, where military experience was often viewed with suspicion or hostility. Eventually, Becker found work in the emerging German aerospace industry, contributing to civil aircraft development and later to Bundeswehr aviation establishment. His experiences in American captivity, particularly his observations about training programs and systematic approaches to complex challenges, influenced his thinking about how German aviation might rebuild and develop during the post-war period. In private conversations with other former Luftwaffe personnel during the 1950s and 60s, Becker would sometimes reflect on his encounter with Second Lieutenant Patterson in that Mississippi camp during April 1945. The young American pilot, with his 380 hours of training, had represented something profound, not merely an individual, but the product of a system that could transform ordinary young men into competent combat pilots efficiently and at scale. That system, more than any specific aircraft or weapon, had won the air war. The P-51 Mustang was a superb fighter, but it would have been far less effective without the thoroughly trained pilots who flew it, the systematic maintenance that kept it operational, the efficient logistics that supplied it, and the organizational infrastructure that sustained combat operations over time. American victory resulted from the integration of all these elements into a coherent, effective military system. The training revelations that Becker and thousands of other Luftwaffe prisoners experienced during American captivity represented a final, definitive understanding of why Germany lost. It was not bad luck, not tactical errors, not even primarily the simple material superiority of Allied forces. It was the systematic, organized, efficiently managed application of vast resources to every aspect of military operations, from aircraft production to pilot training to maintenance logistics to combat operations. America had industrialized warfare in ways that went far beyond merely producing large quantities of weapons. America had industrialized the production of trained personnel, applying mass production thinking to education and creating systems that could transform millions of ordinary citizens into effective military personnel efficiently. This represented a more profound and fundamental advantage than any specific technological achievement or tactical innovation. The Luftwaffe prisoners who witnessed this system in operation, who met the 21-year-old fighter pilots with hundreds of training hours, who learned about the 60 training bases and 15,000 training aircraft, understood with absolute clarity that they had fought against an adversary possessing advantages so overwhelming that defeat was inevitable. The only question had been timing and cost, never the ultimate outcome. This understanding, born from direct observation during captivity rather than abstract analysis or post-war study, shaped how many former Luftwaffe personnel thought about the war, understood their own experiences, and approached post-war life. They had fought courageously and skillfully against impossible odds. Their defeat reflected not personal failure but strategic reality. The enemy they faced possessed resources and organizational capabilities that no amount of tactical excellence could overcome. The legacy of these training revelations extended beyond individual understanding to influence broader German military thinking during the post-war period. The emphasis on systematic training, documented procedures, and thorough preparation that characterized Bundeswehr development reflected lessons learned by former Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe officers who had observed American approaches firsthand during captivity. The story of Klaus Becker's encounter with the young American pilot in that Mississippi camp represents thousands of similar interactions between German prisoners and American military personnel during 1944 and 1945. Each conversation, each observation, each glimpse of American training infrastructure added to the cumulative evidence that convinced German prisoners of Allied superiority in areas they had believed represented German advantages. The 21-year-old, with 380 hours of training, was not an anomaly or an exceptional case. He was the standard product of a system that produced such pilots routinely, efficiently, and at scales Germany could not match. That systematic capability, more than any individual achievement or specific technology, explained American victory and German defeat. The training of American military aviators during World War II remains one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in military history. The scale, efficiency, and effectiveness of programs that transformed hundreds of thousands of civilians into qualified pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and ground personnel in compressed timeframes demonstrated American organizational capability and resource abundance. German prisoners who witnessed this system in operation understood that they had faced an adversary whose advantages extended far beyond simple material superiority to encompass systematic approaches that made effective use of vast resources. Klaus Becker's simple question to Second Lieutenant Patterson, "How many hours do you have?" had received an answer that shattered comfortable assumptions about German pilot superiority. 380 hours. More training than many Luftwaffe pilots accumulated in their entire careers. And Patterson was not exceptional. He was typical of American pilots, the standard product of a system that operated efficiently at massive scale. That revelation, repeated in thousands of interactions between German prisoners and young American military personnel across camps throughout the United States, provided the final, definitive answer to why Germany lost the air war. Not primarily through material superiority, though that certainly existed, not primarily through numerical advantage, though numbers mattered greatly, but through systematic, organized, efficient application of vast resources to every aspect of military operations, creating integrated systems that functioned effectively at scale. The Luftwaffe prisoners could not believe that P-51 pilots were 21 years old, because such youth contradicted their assumptions about the training and experience required to fly high-performance fighters effectively in combat. When they learned that these young pilots had received more thorough training than most German pilots, flew superior aircraft, operated within effective support systems, and fought as part of well-coordinated formations, the prisoners finally understood the true magnitude of the advantages that had made their defeat inevitable. The understanding came too late to affect the war's outcome, but it profoundly shaped how these men thought about their experiences and approached post-war life. They had fought against an adversary whose capabilities exceeded German achievements, not merely in industrial production, but in systematic organization, efficient training, and effective use of human resources. The lesson was clear, sobering, and definitive. Modern warfare required not merely courage and skill, but also vast resources, efficiently organized through systematic approaches that America had mastered more effectively than any nation on Earth. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.